Temptation is all around us. Everywhere you go, you're tempted by something. Often those temptations are to go outside of God's will for our life. So how do we fight this? And how do we overcome this temptation? Well, let's learn by looking at the very first time mankind was tempted. Let's check it out.
Well, good morning. Hey, thank you for being here today. And hey, before we get in, I want to encourage you a little bit because it's summer in Phoenix. All right, is that all I had to say? I've lived here my whole life, okay? I know it's hot, and it's even worse when it's like hot and like blowing a lot, and it's a little bit of humidity in the air, and it's not even raining, right? We're just being teased right now. It's like, it rained, and I was so excited, and it was like 20 minutes, made my pool terrible, and then stopped. I'm like, that wasn't even worth it, right? But in the summer in Phoenix, a lot of times we talk about just surviving the heat, right? Like stay indoors, stay in a pool, get out of town for a few weeks if you can. And it's like weathering the storm or the heat to get through the summer to get kind of back to our lives. But I want to encourage you, as I've lived here, like I said, my whole life, and I've gone to church my whole life. So I've seen this cycle of church, especially in Phoenix and Arizona. And sometimes the summer can be the same way in our spiritual lives. It's like, I just kind of need to survive. I just need to get my Jesus once a month or something, and I need to just get by until the real life school starts again and I can get back into my rhythms. But I want to encourage you to be praying, be seeking God when you are in town, when you are here, be here at church, and instead of just surviving in your spiritual life, what would it look like to continue to take ground, to continue to have Christ work in your life in some way that you see some transformation. So I want to encourage you, I want to thank you again for being here. As Scott said, I want to encourage you, if you are involved in someone's life and help raising a child, come join us tonight. This is our second week. If you missed the first one, that's okay. But it's going to be a great time where we're going to worship. It starts at 5 o'clock, not 6, like Scott said, so don't show up at 6. But show up at 5 o'clock. We're going to worship. We're going to have some food, some games, and we're also going to learn how to be better parents. So that's what I'm most excited and frightened about, personally. But today, as we get into this, I kind of had this thought as I'm reading our passage and preparing for today that temptation is everywhere. We are tempted to compare people around us to ourselves. We are tempted to cheat on our diet when we've been doing so good. We are tempted to just sit on the couch and do nothing when we know our house or apartment needs to be cleaned. We're tempted to scroll on social media when we should be doing our job. I know your secret out there, okay? I'm not the only one. I know you do it too. We're tempted to look at that or to burn this way. Whatever that temptation is, maybe it's temptation to drink, to smoke, to lust. Temptation is all around us. And today, as we kind of jump into our passage, we're going to talk about what is temptation, but also how do we fight against it. Let's start with this, and I want to start with a key thought today of talking about what is temptation really? And it is this, temptation is anything that promises satisfaction. Okay, it promises it at the cost of obedience to God. It says, try this, do this, engage in this, but in the back of your mind, you know something isn't right. This past week, my daughter, we have a pretty strict bedtime kind of policy. Like, we have 3 kids, 5 and under. If you've been here, you know this. And I'm crazy about it. I want my time to sit on the couch and watch TV, okay? Like, without children running around me. Just go to bed and leave me alone, okay? I need some quiet. And so 7 o'clock, they're in bed. And they better be sleeping or they're going to be held down until they sleep, right? So my son has to come out like 5 times to pee or something. I'm like, stop! But anyway, they said that right before my wife's putting our baby to bed, and then all of a sudden I'm with the 2 older kids, 4 and 5, and we're reading books, and I'm like, all right, let's go. And they're like, piggyback ride. I'm like, I'm one person. There's 2 of you. We tried this before. You cried because it didn't end well, right? I tried to take both of you on my back. It ended miserably. So I'm like, all right, no. Archie, you asked first. So you get a piggyback ride today. Aria, you get a piggyback ride tomorrow night. Great solution, right? Aria disagreed. She threw a fit. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to leave you there. Go put Archie to bed. I come back. She's still pouting. Won't move, won't listen, completely shut down. Start counting. She runs in her room, lays on the ground. I'm like, okay, let me tuck you in. won't speak to me, won't say words. And I'm like, fine, I'll just leave you there. And I literally just leave. And I'm like, she'll go to bed eventually. And I'm watching my show, and every 10 minutes I hear, and I'm like, what is happening? And I'm getting so angry. I'm like, if she wakes up the baby, it's on, right? So finally I lost it, and I went in there, took her on my back, took her a piggyback ride around the house, did a lap, and took back. Should have solved the problem, right? No! She was still angry. And at that moment in my mind, I just lost my parent cred. I just stood firm. I was like, I'm gonna parent this. I'm gonna put my foot down. I'm not gonna backslide. I'm not gonna show weakness. And then I did it anyway. And then the results I wanted didn't even pay off. And temptation is like that. It promises you results. It promises you a relief. It promises you kind of some satisfaction in the background and says it's going to be okay. And then it actually happens and you're like, I'm full of more regret than I am with actual satisfaction on the results. And that's the lie we get in this. And today, as we are continuing in our series, Counterculture, studying through the book of Genesis, we're gonna see that the first time mankind was tempted. And up to this point, if you've been kind of following us, God has created this perfect world. And he created this amazing earth, and he created man and woman. He put them in this paradise in the garden called Eden. And he filled it with plants and animals in this wonderful system, and they had it made. Everything was great. But then the temptation came. So here's what I want us to ask this morning as we kind of explore our own lives, as we study the very first time that men and women were tempted, is what can we learn from mankind's first temptation? This past week, and if you have your Bibles, go ahead and flip to Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 1 is where we're going to be today. But I appreciated this last week I got coffee with a young guy, and he had visited our Celebrate Recovery a couple times. And one of the things he said that just struck out to me and I loved, he said, when I came to Celebrate Recovery, what I appreciated is I found out I wasn't alone. And sometimes in our mind, we think I'm the only one that struggles with this. We think in the back of our mind, if other people knew the true me, they wouldn't want to be around me. If they knew what goes through my head, they wouldn't want to associate with me. If they knew the thoughts and the things that I have, they would realize that I'm like a degenerate weirdo. But when we're honest, we realize we are a degenerate weirdo, but everyone else is too, so it's okay, right? And as we go through this, there might be something wrestling in your hearts. And as we talk about temptations, things that our heart is drawn to and things that we have ultimately given into, that we need to realize that other people are struggling with the same thing and God's grace covers it all. So today, when we start this journey and we ask, what does this lead to? What can we learn from seeing the temptation that the first man and woman did? The first thing we see is there was an ultimate tempter in Satan. Check out Genesis chapter 3, starting in verse 1. It says this, now the serpent was the most cunning of all the wild animals that the Lord God had made. Now I want to stop right here before we kind of continue on here, because there's an important thing here. We're introduced to a new character in the Genesis story. Up to this point, in chapter 1, the first character we see, and the only one that's really talked about in depth, is God. God, the creator, God who is speaking things into existence. And then he's creating animals, he's creating plants, but finally we get two new characters when he creates man and he creates woman. And we examine those the last couple weeks, and we're gonna learn their names later in this chapter are Adam and Eve. But in that, all of a sudden, then in chapter 3, verse 1, it introduces this next character and says, the serpent. Now, in the serpent, he's not plainly here called Satan, but based on a few things of the Hebrew meaning of serpent, the tradition associated with this story, and other verses that comment on the story from farther out in the Bible, it's pretty safe to say this is Satan. Now, Satan is a character that was not created on the earth, but that we read about in chapter 1, but instead he was created in the heavenly host, and he was an angel of God, but he was one that rebelled against him, and he had fallen. And this word actually comes from the Hebrew word Satan, which means adversary. In the New Testament, he would be referred to as devil or diablos in the Greek. And I think a bird might be in our actual sanctuary right now. I don't know what happened there. He was agreeing with me. But here's what's so interesting. As this character gets introduced, look at a few of why this is so important is at the end of chapter 2, verse 25, this is how that chapter ends. It says this, that both the man and his wife were naked, yet they felt no shame. They're in the garden. They're in this perfect paradise, protected by God, this kind of area, this nature, this system that God had set up, and there was no shame. They were naked. They were walking around. It was a great resort. It was awesome, right? But then chapter 3, it says, now the serpent was the most cunning of all the wild animals. You see, there's kind of a literary play here, is this idea of naked versus cunning. Some translations actually in the English, I kind of like how they say this. They say they were nude and that the serpent was shrewd. You see, there was this sense that this nakedness, there was an openness. There was a vulnerability. There was kind of letting their guard down. Which you know in a relationship, in a positive, healthy marriage is a great thing, right? To walk around naked when your kids aren't in the house, okay? It's gonna go weird. I'm not gonna go too far into that. But there's a beauty in that. But there's also a vulnerability that can be taken advantage of if someone has the wrong intentions. And here we see that with Satan, is he sees Adam and Eve and he sees them, I can take advantage of them. I can expose them. I can do something and disrupt what they have. Now, here's what we kind of need to say here and land firm. I think what it introduces on us to here is that there is a very real devil. And there is a very real devil that we fall victim to in our world as a broken place. Now, if you know me or if you've heard me preach before, I'm a very rational, logical person. I have a math and science brain. I love it. It's just how God wired me. So I see things in numbers. I see things in practical solutions. So I have the tendency not to over-spiritualize things. We had someone coming to our church for a while, and it progressively saw that there were some warning signs, whether it's some mental illness and some drug use. So finally, we got to contact that person's family. And we expressed like, hey, here are some of our what we're worried about, and here's some ways we can get help. Here's some places we can go. Here's some programs we can plug into. And I talked to the father, and the father came to me and he said, I agree with you, but let me tell you, I have demons following me around all the time. And he showed me videos of swirling lights. And as I'm like talking to some professionals about this, they're like, that's a sure sign of schizophrenia. And you see everything I tried to say of like, hey, here's some help. Let's get some help. He's like, yeah, but the demons. And sometimes in our world, we can over-spiritualize things. And we can say, oh yeah, I don't actually have any issues in my life. It's not my wrong decision-making. It's not the drugs in my life or this addiction in my life. It's just because Satan hates me and the demons are after me and they're all going for me. But we can also fall in the other trap. Sometimes we can under-spiritualize things. And we can under-spiritualize things, meaning that there are some adversaries out there that when they want to take you down, that on your own you are powerless against. And you see Adam and Eve here, they were woefully unprepared to fight this enemy because they didn't look to the right source for deliverance, which we'll see in just a minute. But I want to see let's go on and see how Satan starts to expose them in the second half of verse 1. It says this, he said to the woman, and listen to this question, did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? Did God really say? This is the key word here that he uses is really. Did God really say that? And that's the same word that we fall prey to today. Is it really that bad if it's just this one time? Is it really a sin if I just look and I don't engage? Is it really that bad if it's just one drink and nobody's gonna know and I can just go back to my life? And that question of really is the oldest trick in the book that Satan uses here, but that is still so damaging for us today. But not only will we learn that there's an ultimate tempter in Satan, but also we can see from here and starting in verse 2 that there is nowhere to escape temptation completely. Chapter 3, starting in verse 2, let's keep reading. It said, the woman said to the serpent, we may eat the fruit from the trees in the garden, But about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, God said, you must not eat it or touch it, or you will die. Here's what's so crazy about this story. And as I was reading this, this was immediately what popped into my mind, is if you think of a perfect environment that someone would be safe from temptation, it would be living in a paradise that God provided. And you never knowing sin, right? Like they didn't even know what sin was. How could they be tempted by sin? They were in a perfect, literally bubble of paradise that God had set up for them. And God was walking around patrolling the garden. So the tempter was smart and found a good opportunity, but they could have been like, hey, God, he's here. Hey, what is this guy? Get him out of the garden. But they didn't do that, right? This was the perfect environment, but we see that there is really nowhere we can escape temptation completely. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12 says, whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall. You see, Eve never saw this coming. And she was woefully unprepared and to deal with this. And often, I think we can fall into this trap of thinking we're only going to be tempted when we're at our lowest. And that might happen. Maybe Satan will kind of kick you while you're down. But sometimes he attacks us when we're at our strongest, when we perceive we're at our best, when things are looking great. You're like, there's no problems. My family goes to church. My kids are nice this week. Like everything is great. Like I'm never going to have any issues. And that's when the kill shot comes in. And you see, I would argue here that Eve was too comfortable and she was also not knowledgeable. She didn't expect it, so she didn't run to God when it happened. And then here's the crazy thing. When it did happen, she wasn't even knowledgeable to say it. A few things about her response. One, she doesn't say no. She doesn't correct him and say, when he said, did God really say that? She doesn't go, no, he didn't say that. Instead, she just says, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden. But she said, but the fruit in the middle of the garden, which one, again, if you go back up to verse 16 and 17 of chapter 2, it says, the Lord God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree of the garden, but you not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For on the day you eat from it, you will certainly die. A couple things she does is she doesn't even remember his words right. One, he names the tree. She doesn't name the tree. She's like, that one over there. I think it's important. I don't know. But then she also adds on to it. She says, you must not touch it, which God doesn't even say not to touch it. He says, don't eat from it. But she adds on to his commands. And the problem here that we see is she doesn't even know what she was saying. She was just throwing out half-truths. And I think sometimes when we're tempted, when we have something come against us, we don't even know what God's word says. We don't even know the right way. We're just like, I think I'm not supposed to do that, or maybe this. And we just start throwing stuff out to see if it sticks in the wall. And we slowly sink deeper and deeper and deeper. But I think another important point for us to kind of pull out of these couple verses is we will never get to a place where we can just sit back and say, no more temptation is coming my way. That we always have to be ready. That we always have to have in the back of our mind that something can attack us, that something can come at us. But our learnings from this story doesn't stop there, because we also see that there is an element of truth in every temptation. Keep reading in verse 4. In verse 4 or 5 here, he says, no. It's funny that he then corrects her. No, you will not die, the serpent said to the woman. In fact, God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. You know, one of the things that's funny is it's easy to point out when something is completely false or complete garbage in our life. Maybe you've experienced this before. If you ever fell asleep on the couch before we had Netflix and then it just stopped, right? But you fall asleep on the couch watching cable TV, and then you wake up in the middle of the night. What's rolling? Anyone? Infomercials. Yeah. That takes you back. And not even the good infomercials. They don't play the good infomercials at 2 a.m. or 1 a.m. or something, right? They play the really terrible ones. And they say hey, for 3 payments of $19.95, you can get a shredded body like this. It's that's not true. Because I actually have to do the workout. I have to change my diet. I have to do all these steps. I don't just pay the money and then I get shredded abs, right? I got to do all this other stuff. And it's easy when we're presented with an opportunity and we're like, yeah, that's garbage. I know that's not true. I'm not going to follow that. But what's harder is what we see here is when some truth is slipped into it. You see, Satan gives an element of truth here. He said they would become like God, knowing good and evil. And that was true. He was absolutely right in making the promise that did come to pass, as they knew the difference between right and wrong, between good and evil, but he failed to mention the consequences that would also come with that. Remember what we said at the beginning of this, that temptation is anything that promises satisfaction at the cost of obedience to God. There are a lot of things in our world that can bring satisfaction. Alcohol can bring satisfaction. Lust and pornography can bring satisfaction. Extramarital affairs can bring satisfaction. Overeating, lying, gossip, stealing, they can all bring some form of satisfaction. But they also bring some consequences with it. And too often we can be so infatuated with the partial truth that is there that we fail to recognize that that satisfaction will come, but then it fades away very, very quickly. And then we're left with the baggage that it brings. But here's an important distinction we must make as we continue on in this story, that yes, temptation is real, that there is a tempter in Satan that will never fully escape it, that there's even truth that's partly in that temptation, but we also need to distinguish the fact that there is no sin in being tempted, but ultimately giving into it. Let's keep reading in verse 6. And it says, the woman saw that the tree was good for food and delightful to look at, in that it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. I want to stop right here, and I want to make a little point. I think observation here is I'm going to argue that I don't think at this point Eve has sinned yet. She's looking at it. And we know that sin begins in the heart, but she hasn't even fully disobeyed God yet. But she looks at it and then see a few of the things. She saw that the tree was good for food. Okay, that's true. She saw that it was delightful to look at. Okay, that's fine. And that it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. But there hasn't been a step yet. She's being tempted. She sees it. He's kind of whetting her appetite, and she sees what's coming. But here's where it starts to kind of switch over. And here in the second half of verse 6, it says, so she took some of its fruit and she ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Now, I think sometimes we can get in this wrong idea that if I'm being tempted towards something, then I'm sinning and I'm making a mistake. And here's the deal, is like we said, we will never fully escape temptation. Temptation even came to Jesus when he was here on earth. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are. This is the important part, yet without sin. You see, temptations will come to us. But the difference is that Jesus did not give in to that temptation, did not give in to that sin like Adam and Eve did. And this sin started for them. They saw that it was there, but then they took the action step to fully engage with it. Another important point here that we see is some may say jokingly, some say all too seriously, that what we see in the first, right, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, that it was the woman's fault at the very beginning of creation that caused it. You didn't laugh because that's going to get me canceled. But I love the line, she gave it to her husband, but then it mentions right there who was with her. The dude was standing idly by the entire time. He was watching this unfold. Some have argued whether he could hear Satan or not. We don't know. But we do know he was standing there. He watched her pluck the fruit. He watched her eat it. And then she gave it to him and he took a bite too. In godly leadership, godly partnership is when we are there with people who are being tempted, of not just letting them fall to it, not giving into it, but helping lead them away from it so they can conquer that ultimately. And here we see something important, that the temptation happened, but ultimately the sin came in when they gave themselves over to it, when they gave up and they gave in, which leads to this very last part of it in verse 7, is that there will always be shame when we fall to temptation. Check out verse 7. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together, and they made coverings for themselves. we mentioned that chapter 2 ends, and this nakedness is a celebration. This nakedness is a good thing. It's kind of the pinnacle of their marriage. It shows how close they are, how bonded they are, that they are one flesh, that they are together, and they're comfortable in the goodness of God that he created them in. But then all of a sudden in verse 7, after they have disobeyed, it forever changes their worldview. It forever changes how they see things around them. No longer is there innocence. No longer is there seeing beauty in God's creation, but there is skepticism, there is distrust, there is an awareness of their fragility and their imperfection. You see, when sin entered the world, it takes something from them that they can never get back on their own. There are moments in our lives where this can happen to us. When we talk about Celebrate Recovery, and one of the things the big thing in there is getting freedom from our hurts, habits, and hangups. And if you talk to someone who goes through a recovery program and continues to, they can a lot of times trace back in their life of what kind of maybe is the moment or what is the time in their life that all of a sudden kind of started this downward spiral. When did they get the taste of that addiction that they just couldn't kick? And for us, there are going to be moments in our lives where maybe it's the first drink, the first look at something that you know is not right, and something in your life, that first work gossip, right? And then you just can't get away from that tea anymore. Or that first time you threw someone under the bus and all of a sudden it helped you. And then we get addicted to it in some way, and it changes how we see our world. And today we need to ask ourselves, is what has happened in our lives that has led to temptation, that has hurt you ever since? Because if you're honest with yourself, there's something. And maybe some of us are better at admitting it and better at dealing with it than others. But in all of our lives, there's something that has hurt us, that has pulled us, that has taken us from God's design and promised us some satisfaction. But when we get it, it works for a second, but it quickly fades away. You see, this leads ultimately to even bigger consequences in this. And the rest of chapter 3 that Scott's going to be preaching next week, we're going to see the consequences that this not only had for Adam and Eve, but the consequences that this had for all of mankind. But you see, when we give in to our temptation, it will always lead to shame, to baggage, to carrying that around. But today I want to ask is, what are you carrying around that is causing you that shame, that is causing you to hold this? You see, this has been a hard message to probably take in. And I will say, it was a hard message to write this past week. But here's where I want to end. I want to end first on giving 2 kind of steps, I think, and a few words of encouragement. And some things we need to remember when we go through life and we see these temptations and we know they will come. Is the first one is, God will never tempt you. James chapter 1, verse 13 says, no one who is undergoing a trial should say, I am being tempted by God. Since God is not tempted by evil, and he himself doesn't tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when he is drawn away and he is enticed by his own evil desire. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. When sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death. You see, there will be moments in our life where God will test us. Maybe he puts a trial in our life, or he puts a season in our life where we got to go through and we got to just grind it out. But he will not go as far to tempt us to sin. God tests us to push us forward, but Satan tempts us to pull us back into our former life. And there may be seasons of testing where God is asking you to be patient. God is asking you to trust him more, but he will never tempt you into sin. And when those times of temptation comes, it is the sinful flesh inside us and it is Satan working behind the scenes. But not only will God not tempt us, the second thing we need to remember is God will never leave you. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 says, no temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity. But God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with temptation, he will also provide the way out so that you may also be able to bear it. I love that. God will not tempt you more than you can hold, more than you can bear. But the second line is important of why that's the case, is God will provide a way out. When you're tempted, are you looking for the way out that God is opening up? Which brings us to our very last thought. And if you leave with nothing today, this is what I just want to burn into your head today. Our key thought that we're going to leave with is every temptation is an invitation to depend on Christ. You see, temptation's going to come, whether we like it or not. But with temptation is the opportunity to depend on Jesus Christ. I love when you look at the ministry of Jesus. For 40 days and 40 nights, he went out into the desert and he fasted. And it was actually at his weakest point that when Satan came and tried to topple him over. But Satan tempted him, but it didn't work because Jesus overcame him. And it didn't work that because even though Satan tried to start this at the very beginning, Satan, by tempting Adam and Eve, he brought sin into the world. He brought this world of brokenness, of hurt. And he thought eventually that he can topple God. He can make a world that is so messed up that people will run from him. But it didn't work because when Jesus came, he lived, he died on the cross for you and for me, so no longer do we have to be held to that shame, held to that baggage, and victims of that temptation anymore. You see, I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what tempts you. I don't know what you're ashamed of. I don't know what you hide behind your heart and behind your mind that you just wish never happened, you wish nobody ever knows about. But I will tell you, God knows about it. And he doesn't reject you for it, but he loves you in spite of it. And he died because of it. No matter what you're going through, Jesus is better, Jesus is greater, and Jesus is ready and waiting to help you overcome it. This morning, I want to ask you, are you ready to stop doing it on your own? Are you ready to stop standing in the middle of a garden, naked, alone, afraid? And are you ready to look to God in his power to deliver you from it? My hope and my prayer for you today is that you don't see temptation as an obstacle to run from, as another obstacle to fall into, but that is an opportunity to depend more on the power of Christ. Let's pray this morning.